Hi everyone, welcome to this video. Today I'm going to be talking about paper stretching. The reason I've chosen paper stretching for the first video proper for this channel is that's what I was going to do in our next class at House of Illustration before we got interrupted by the virus. So I just thought I'd get that done and shown to you. This video is going to just contain me talking about what paper stretching is, why you would do it, and then I'm going to go through the process with you step by step in terms of getting your paper stretched. But to begin with, just to summarize what paper stretching involves, it means getting a sheet of paper, whatever you've decided to paint on, using ink, watercolor or gouache, but it could be other wet materials also, and you immerse that paper fully in water and soak it over several minutes, 10 to 20 minutes, so that it becomes evenly wet. And that's an important point, the fact that it's evenly wetted, soaked through. Then you take your piece of paper once you've allowed it to soak for a few minutes, take it out and place it onto a hard board, ideally a wooden board or thick wooden paneling. Place it on there, and then you secure the paper to the board using a very specific particular type of tape. I've got a roll here. This is called gum tape, or art gum tape, or sometimes referred to as watercolor gum tape. So basically it's a brown paper tape with one gum side on it, and importantly it's the gum becomes sticky when wet. So wetness activates the stickiness of the tape. So you would wet the tape itself, and I will show you how you go about doing that, and then place the tape on each edge of the paper, pressing it down on there so that the paper becomes secure to the board, and then you allow it to dry over several hours, ideally overnight. And what occurs is that through wetting and wetting evenly, the paper swells up and expands through the wetness. And then when you place it on the board and secure it with the tape, over time as it dries, it will contract and become very taut and tight to the board. And then when you come to paint, there won't be any give in it. When you paint, it will remain flat, and that is essentially why you would stretch paper. It's to avoid any kind of buckling, so that's where the paper becomes uneven as you paint it. I'm sure we've all experienced that during the class and at other times. To avoid buckling both through whilst you're painting and at the end when it's dried, so that you end up with a flat image. Okay, so that's the basic summary of the process and why you would do it, to avoid buckling. Now you've got to decide for yourself when and if you need to paper stretch. So it particularly applies when you're going to use the entire surface of the paper, when you're doing lots of wet on wet, perhaps doing a landscape, for example, and you know that you're going to use the entire coverage of what you have in front of you. So if you are doing a small image, perhaps in the middle of your paper, and you're just dropping a little bit of colour on, say, a line drawing and so on, then you might not feel the need to stretch it because buckling will be minimal. But if you know you're going to do lots of wet on wet action, even if you're not going to use the whole of the paper, maybe the centre of the paper, but there's going to be a lot of wetting and lots of paint liquid added to it, then you have to judge that, how much buckling is there likely to be, and if you think, well, I think there's going to be a fair amount potentially, then that's why you might stretch it. Also, it's dependent on what paper you use as well. If you're using really heavy paper, and I'm talking in the regions of 600 grams per square meter for instance, maybe down to about 500, then you probably won't need to stretch it, because it's thick enough to be able to withstand a lot of wetting, a lot of wet on wet, and not show any signs of buckling. I use a paper just a little bit heavier than 600 grams per square meter sometimes, and I never feel the need to stretch that. Below that, then you will probably find the need to do it, and 300 grams sort of standard watercolor paper you would usually need or find you need to have it stretched if, again, you're going to use lots of water on it. If you go lighter than that, into sort of 250, 220, 200, or even lower than that, then paper stretching becomes more and more necessary, because the lighter the paper, the thinner it is, the more it will buckle. So if, for instance, you've only got lightweight paper, that's maybe all you can afford at the moment, or you can't get to the shop because of the situation, then paper stretching might be necessary, although you will need to get gum tape, of course. Okay, but if you're just using a little amount of the paper, then perhaps you'll probably be fine. During the class, we generally used A5 paper for a lot of the exercises that we did, and that was for several reasons. One of them being because we had limited time to do some of the assignments. Working smaller ensured that we could finish them in time generally, but one of the other reasons was to minimize the effect of buckling on our work. So the smaller the piece of paper, the less of an issue buckling can be. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it doesn't necessarily impede you in terms of what you're trying to do as much as it would as the paper gets larger and larger. This is an A4 sheet of paper. Once you get to A4 and beyond, then you find that buckling can cause a bit of an issue for you. But if you're doing small images, even if you're using the whole of the paper, you might not necessarily find you need to stretch it in this manner. But let's have a look at what happens to paper and compare paper in different situations in terms of buckling. I've got a sheet of paper here. This is 220 grams per square meter, so it's a little bit lighter than our usual sort of 300 grams per square meter, just as an example. And I hope you can see that there. That's an A4 sheet, and I'm going to wet this. And I'm just going to use a water wash first across there with my big wash brush, similar to ones we used in class. And I think you can see immediately how the paper is reacting to that. So this paper not secured at all, just standing free, and you can see how much that is. Well, there's a big buckle in the middle, like so. You can see how it's losing its flatness and shape like that. And that obviously becomes an issue when I'm trying to put a wash on there whilst it's wet. If I'm trying to add wet on wet and trying to add colour to that, that makes the process a little bit trickier, because I'm not working on a flat surface. So for instance, if I'm putting colour here where it's sort of buckling or bent away, it's going to start trickling down there, and I might not want that to happen. Working with watercolour and wet on wet, it can be tricky enough at the best times. So you want everything that you're working with to be working with you, not against you, and buckling can be a bit of an obstacle to get what you want. Now, if you remember, I think in one of the classes certainly, we used boards and actually secured our paper with masking tape, and masking tape can be used to keep paper to the board and minimize buckling to a certain extent, but it won't necessarily eradicate it, both through the process and afterwards. So this is the exact same type of paper. It's the same 220, did I say, grams per square meter, and that's been secured to a board with masking tape, and it's not buckling to the extent of the paper that wasn't secured was buckling, but it is uneven, and I'm not sure you can see it. I've already wetted this to show that, but I can show now by adding, I think you can see there's a big bump in the middle there, and sort of peaks and troughs right across. And again, that's just not making the painting experience particularly pleasant. Now, a 300 gram per square meter paper wouldn't necessarily buckle quite as much as this, because this is thinner paper, but it would still be buckling with masking tape around it. And the issue with the masking tape is that we can't get even wetness. The paper can't be fully soaked, partly because the paper is secured around the edges, so those areas are remaining dry. It's very difficult to know if you can get even wetness when you're applying it onto the top, like so, and the paper is just simply not taut and stretched to the board. So whilst masking tape helps to a certain degree in terms of avoiding a big buckle in the middle, it's not necessarily getting rid of the issue entirely. But again, if you're just using a little bit, if you know you're not using huge wash across and maybe little bits of watercolour in certain specific areas, then you might find that masking tape's absolutely fine for that. So a bit of trial and error and working it out when you need perhaps to paper stretch and when not. In many instances, particularly instances, it's similar to when we were doing little drawn images and adding colour, you would find that it's not necessarily a problem. Okay, let's get rid of that hair there. And just to do a final comparison, let's take the paper that has been stretched, and again the exact same paper that's being used, and we'll see how this compares. So I'm going to put my wash on here as I did with the first piece of paper, and my paper's getting wet, but it's not reacting to it in the way the other papers did. It's remaining nice and flat, nice and taut to the board, and I can see, and hopefully you can see there as I add the colour that there are no peaks and troughs as I'm working. My paper's remaining flat throughout, and that's just making the process that much more pleasant. I just have to deal with the issue at hand, which is controlling my colour. I don't have to deal with anything else. Unexpected issues with gravity and trickling down into troughs or valleys, like so. So, you see that comparison there. And so that's avoiding buckling during the process of painting. And then we have the issue of buckling after the fact, once it's dried. Now, once a piece of paper has dried, the buckling generally won't be as severe as it can happen whilst it's wet, but we can see bits of buckling when a piece of paper is dried. The question is it an issue? So if you're just exploring and experimenting, you might not be bothered if your paper is a little bit buckled at the end. It might not be an issue for you. So you don't necessarily need to worry about stretching it. If you know you're doing watercolour or ink or gouache and then going to scan it in and eventually the final image is going to be digital in some form, you might find that paper that's only buckled a little bit scans perfectly well. It becomes more an issue if the paper is larger, and occasionally buckling can be an issue when you're trying to reproduce work. It depends on the extent of the buckling, but if you've got a large piece of paper and you're trying to photograph it nicely, if it's buckled, it can affect the way the light hits the image, and that can be an issue. Where I think paper stretching really does help is if you're going to, sell your work, sell originals, and certainly have originals put in frames. I think avoiding buckling becomes more important there. So when you put an image in a mount, then put that in a frame, you want that image to lay flat against the mount. And likewise, I think it's nicer if you're selling work, if you can sell it flat. It's not essential, but personally, I would prefer if my imagery was as flat and the pictures being displayed as best as possible. You might have heard my cat, he wants to come in here. That's Charlie. Perhaps you'll get to know Charlie a little bit as I make more and more of these videos. Okay, so let's just make one final comparison of imagery once it's dried. So I'm just going to take that board away for a moment. And so this is actually 300 gram per square meter paper, and you can see it's dried. This was not secured to any board, and you can see there's quite a pronounced buckle in that. There, the centre is relatively flat, but there's a buckle there, and if you were trying to, you could just about get that in the mount, but it wouldn't be brilliant like that. It's kind of lower quality paper, but just in case you're wondering what about 100% cotton paper, well, that will still buckle as well. So this is much better quality paper. Again, this wasn't secured to a board or anything, and you can see it's maybe not buckled quite to the same extent, but it's not that far off. Okay. Buckling around the edges. Now this is an image this is a piece of paper that was masking taped to a board, and you see it's not too bad, not as buckled as the previous two examples there. I don't know if you can see that there, a little bit of buckling. Here it's not entirely flat. You might say, I could live with that, and that's just something for you to decide personally about that. And then just finally, here is a piece of paper that was stretched, and hopefully you can see how nice and flat that has turned out on there. If you can imagine that sitting in a frame, that'd be very effective, I think. Okay, So I think that's covered generally what paper stretching is and why we would do it. We're going to move on now to showing you the process of doing it step by step.